On the south coast of Kenya, there is a stretch of black, stinking mud that is worth more than the trees standing in it. Not metaphorically, measurably. Dig down through that mud and you find carbon laid down over centuries, waterlogged, unable to rot. A hectare of mangrove can hold several times the carbon of a hectare of rainforest, and most of it isn't in the wood at all. It's underfoot, which raises a very awkward question. If that mud is that valuable, who gets paid for it? This is Gazi Bay, about 50 kilometers south of Mombasa. Two villages sit on its edge, Gazi and Makanjeni, around 4,000 people. Fishermen mostly, some farming, not much else. And for as long as anyone could remember, the mangroves were the hardware store and the fuel depot. Straight, salt-resistant poles for roof beams. Dense, slow-burning wood for the cooking fire. If you needed a house or a hot meal, you walked into the swamp with a panga. Then, in the 1970s, it stopped being a village-scale thing. Gazi's mangroves were clear-felled at industrial scale for poles and wood chips, shipped out to the Gulf. Whole stands went flat. Here's what a stripped mangrove does. The roots that held the sediment let go. The mud oxidizes and starts releasing carbon it had been holding since before anyone alive was born. The shoreline erodes, and the fish nurseries the tangled, shallow, predator-free root maze where juvenile snapper and prawns grow up simply stop existing. So the catch falls. And when the catch falls, people cut more wood to sell, because it's the only thing left to sell. That's the trap. Poverty and deforestation feeding each other in a loop the tide keeps refreshing. Now the obvious fixes. Kenya tried them. In 1997, the government banned mangrove harvesting outright. A ban doesn't cook dinner. If the forest is off-limits, but the alternative is nothing, the cutting just moves at night. Rules imposed from Nairobi on a swamp 4 hours away enforce themselves about as well as you'd expect. The second obvious fix, plant trees, get the photograph. Except most mangrove replanting fails, and it fails for boring. Specific reason people put the wrong species at the wrong height on the shore. A mangrove that wants 6 hours of tidal flooding a day will drown in 8. Whole planted plots die quietly a year after the camera crew leaves. Which brings us to the man who spent 30 years figuring out the boring specific reason. James Kairo, a marine scientist with the Kenya Marine and Fisheries Research Institute, who began putting experimental mangrove plots into Gazi Bay in the early 1990s as a young researcher, on ground that had been clear-felled a decade before. Not a campaign. Plots. Species matched to tidal zone. Elevation surveyed. Survival counted. Year after year after year. Rise for a low in the flooding zone. Sonoratia where it belongs. Then wait 20 years and measure what actually grew. That patience turned out to be the whole thing. Because by the 2010s, a market had appeared that would pay for carbon, but only if you could prove, with defensible numbers, exactly how much of it your forest was holding and would keep holding. Gazi Bay was one of the few mangrove forests on Earth with 20 years of measured plots sitting in a filing cabinet. Then came the third obvious fix, and the most seductive one. Sell the carbon. Here's why that usually fails for a village. Certifying a carbon project costs real money: verifiers, audits, paperwork, lawyers. A project this small generates a few tens of thousands of dollars a year. The transaction costs eat it. So the market's answer is always the same. Aggregate it, hand it to a developer, and the community becomes a line item, receiving a fraction of a fraction. Kairo and a group of collaborators, including the ecologist Mark Huxham at Edinburgh Napier University, went looking for a way around that. They found the Plan Vivo standard, built specifically for smallholder and community projects, and they set up a small Scottish non-profit to handle the buyers and the paperwork from the other end of the pipe. The community kept ownership. The office work went offshore. That inversion is the innovation more than the trees, more than the mud. In 2013, it launched. Mikoko Pamoja Kiswahili for mangroves together. 117 hectares of mangrove in Gazi Bay, protected and replanted under a 20-year agreement, the first community-led blue carbon project in the world to sell credits on the open market. The numbers are deliberately unglamorous. Around 3,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year, roughly $25,000. $25,000 in climate finance that is a rounding error. In Gazi, it is a budget, and crucially, a budget the village itself votes on every year in public. So what did 4,000 people decide to buy with the carbon in their mud? Water. First and repeatedly, water. Gazi and Makongeni had no pipe supply, which in practice meant women and girls walking every day for water that wasn't clean when they got there. The carbon money paid to lay pipe and put standpipes in the villages. Thousands of people drinking water from a tap financed by carbon dioxide that never made it into the atmosphere. Then schoolbooks, desks, textbooks for classrooms that had been sharing them 3 to a copy, mosquito nets, small things. The kind of things that are only small if you already have them. And the project pays villagers to do the work nursery raising and planting tens of thousands of seedlings and patrolling the forest. That's the quiet reversal. The people who used to cut the mangroves now have a paid reason to count them. Then the part nobody had to pay for. As the canopy closed and the root maze rebuilt itself, the nurseries came back. Fishermen working Gazi Bay started reporting what the ecology predicted: more juveniles in the creeks and better catches outside them. In 2017, the project won the United Nations Development Programme's Enquêteur prize, but the meaningful validation wasn't the trophy. It was that the credits kept selling and the audits kept passing year after year. Now the honest part, because this is a story that survives honesty better than most. Carbon offsetting has had a brutal few years. Investigation after investigation has found forest credits that overstated what they saved projects that claimed to prevent deforestation that was never going to happen. Skepticism is the correct default. Mikoko Pamoja is unusually resistant to that critique for 3 specific reasons. The area is small enough to physically walk. The carbon estimates rest on decades of measured plots, not a modeled counterfactual. And the deforestation it prevents is not hypothetical. The stumps from the 70s are still there. It is also, let's be clear, $25,000 a year. This does not solve climate change. Global emissions are around 40 billion tons a year. 3,000 tons is not a dent. It's a rounding error inside a rounding error. So don't measure it as a climate intervention. Measure it as a discovery about governance, because what Gazi Bay proved is that the unit that actually works is not the megaproject. It's the village when the village owns the asset, controls the money, and can see the forest from the doorstep. And discoveries replicate. In 2019, 30 kilometers down the coast, 3 villages around Vanga launched their own project, Vanga Blue Forest, on several times the area, covering thousands more people using the model Gazi Road. Kenya's coast holds on the order of 60,000 hectares of mangrove. The global figure is roughly 15 million. Mangroves cover a fraction of 1% of the tropics and hold a wildly outsized share of its stored carbon, and almost all of them sit next to a village with a fuel problem and no water supply, which means the constraint was never the trees. It was the paperwork, the standard, and who holds the title. Gazi Bay solved all 3 with a filing cabinet full of 20-year-old measurements and a village meeting under a mango tree. 1 scientist, 4,000 people, 117 hectares of mud that everyone else had written off as a swamp. And in return, running water, a stocked classroom, a forest that grew back, and fish in the roots again. If you want the actual mechanics, the plan vivo structure, the revenue split, how the village committee votes the budget, and the honest arguments about whether blue carbon credits deserve your trust, the full written breakdown is in the link in the description. It's the version with the numbers and the sources for the people who want to check the working. And if you want to know what happens when the 20-year agreement comes up for renewal, that's where we go next.